Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final talk organized by CESCAME this year. And it's a great honor and privilege for us to have Lela Rekhviashvili as our today's speaker. Lela is a researcher at the Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography in Leipzig, Germany, and she will give a talk about informality. The title is "Why Won't Urban Informality Disappear?" Prior to giving floor to Lela, I will briefly introduce today's organizer, CESCAME, which stands for the Center for the Study of Social Change and the Material Environment, based here at the Institute of Sociology of the Academy of Sciences in Prague. CESCAME is a group of 4 researchers led by Slavka Ferenchová, with Anya Decker, Terezia Lochova, and myself as members of the team. And what we do, we are looking at cities as sites where innovation in knowledge and agency originate. We are interested in innovations as new practices and knowledge that emerge from everyday life. And we are interested in everyday strategies that are produced and reproduced in the face of challenges posed by global social, economic, and environmental changes. And we are primarily interested in interactions between formal and informal innovation, and our regional focus is on Central and Eastern Europe, while we are mindful of links to other regions of the world. And now let me introduce Lela, who holds a degree in political science from Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. And as I said, she is currently a researcher at Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography in Leipzig. Her research interests are political economy, urban geography, informal economic practices and urban mobility, marketisation and social embeddedness, contentious action and politics of public space, and also post-socialist and post- or decolonial dialogues. Her academic publications discuss impacts of institutional change, particularly of marketization policies on informal economic practices, and the role of everyday resistance for reconstruction of public space. Lela's regional expertise is in post-socialist Eastern Europe and Eurasia, particularly South Caucasus and Central Asia. She's currently involved in the research project titled Contentious Mobilities, Rethinking Mobility Transitions Through a Decolonial Lens. And she also teaches regional geography of post-Soviet Eurasia and deconstructing Europe, multiple perspectives of Europeanization at universities of Vienna and Leipzig. And she also serves as one of the coordinators of research area self-positioning of Eastern Europe in a new world order at Leibniz Science Campus, Eastern Europe Global Area. Lela, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this extensive and very, very kind introduction. Maybe I turn this around here and I try to share the presentation. I always think a lot whether I should have a presentation or not, but then this time I decided to go for it. I really want to warmly thank you all, and also Slavka, who is not physically here now, for asking me to come here and share some of this mess of the thoughts that I've been carrying around about informality. It really is, for me, I look up to your group, I read up your publications, and I'm very inspired from the work of CESCAME. And it is really particularly precious for me that I can speak together with you about this research on informality in the region. I won't talk much about myself because Petr already very kindly introduced me. But later this will sneak in a little bit. What I wanted to start this talk with was to tell you a bit of a very recent discussion story that I had with a Georgian friend. Funny enough, these days I didn't have so many Georgian friends before, but we have now this kind of small 5-person community in Leipzig, and we get together sometimes. And it was very funny because we were discussing, okay, there is so much buzz about energy crisis in Germany, and people are going crazy that, you know, they might not survive the winter and so on. And this friend was like, yeah, we have survived 90s. I mean, we can survive this. We know how to sleep in, cold rooms, which of course is the case. And then we were reflecting on this, and I really had to say, and this is where the thought of how those experiences matter and will they help kicks in. I had to tell him, yes, we survived 90s, but we might not be able to do so in a group of 5. We survived 90s and what was happening in 90s in Tbilisi, right? Not all of the post-Soviet countries experienced this, but some of those did, or capitals, that you had really extensive blackouts, you had collapse of the entire energy infrastructure, you had no central heating, we had really improvised small gas heatings at points, some people were heating on wood. And we really lived this life where food was provided, it was shared in the courtyard, say within neighborhood. It was given by extensive family networks from the villages. Then the textbooks were shared, right? I grew up like my textbooks would go to my friends, my mom's friend's child. They would add more textbooks. They would come back to my sister 2 years after, then they would travel like this. Clothes would travel like this. Everything would travel like this, right? This was this. And then we would have access to get extra classes because my parents, some friends would help me figure out physics, some others would help me figure out chemistry. But this need, the existence or working of a larger network that has own resources that can be shared. And this cannot be replicated by 5 Georgians in Germany, unless also in Germany, if there was a doomsday, unless we also had such a more resourceful network on which you can draw. And I'm saying this to, in a way, articulate that, yes, when there is a crisis or when there is a doomsday, first of all, this will not be the picture that will arise. If there is any surviving of the doomsday, it will be a collective one and not heroes running from lusts. But more importantly, if we were to survive anything through informal solutions, this would need own resources and they at own vaster networks. And this is nothing to be taken for granted. And because it cannot be taken for granted, we can always say that, yes, informal solutions might work for this and that, but this doesn't mean that many people will not suffer or people will not suffer in various ways. And this is in a way an underlying message that I want to carry out in this talk. Right now, informally presented one, and maybe later more theorized one, that yes, people will figure out something, but this has own costs when you don't structurally look at the suffering of communities that are left alone to struggle with a systemic crisis, right? Informality and crisis are always somehow interwoven, and not just in Central Eastern Europe or Eastern Europe and Eurasia, but also when we look at Global South. With each crisis, I mean, you might remember, this is now COVID and mobilities, right? With each crisis, on the one hand, you have this talk, again, with COVID, you had a lot of talk how informally employed persons in Global South suffer from COVID, right? We also had a lot of talk of how shady employment of Eastern European workers in Germany came through as a very dramatic story, where you could also see this insecurity and suffering and disregard for the health situation of informally employed workers from the East in the West. So in this sense, crisis reveals the vulnerabilities that is associated with informal economy. On the other hand, informality is also seen as this type of solution to the crisis, right? That when the crisis comes, and sometimes it's also seen as a very glorious solution. If you think back to post-financial crisis situation, and if you remember, for example, Manuel Castells was this key face who was working on alternative networks of sharing that occurred, and he was looking a lot at Southern Europe, that occurred in response to the financial crisis, starting from 2007-8, and then following in into some more years, and he would reveal and talk with fascination of all these communities that would share labor, that would share finance, that would share knowledge, etc., etc. So this power of self-mobilizing or community-based mobilizing always resurfaces, and yet there is always this dual danger when we talk of learning or taking from informal practices, because on the one hand, it can easily mean, and we will talk about this later more, it can really mean formalization as marketization, or, appropriation of these practices into more mainstreamed market economy spaces. On the other hand, also abandoning these practices to their own devices might indeed reproduce marginalization and vulnerability. Now, for this talk, and this was just in a way, again, another introduction to say that there is no way to go around this informality topic, right? We continuously will need to talk around it and think around it, especially because we are in numerous crises and we kind of don't have a very good outlook on coming decades, because we can only imagine further crises at this point. At least that would be my outlook per se. Now for this talk, I just wanted to briefly say, where do I speak from, right? But already introduced this. On the one hand, I draw on a lot of research really primarily in Georgia. And in Georgian context, I have been looking at how informal or second economy has been working already in socialist times, how it has been changing in post-socialist times. I was doing more anthropologically grounded research on petty trade and street vending, and also on informal mobility offers, this notorious so-called marshutkas. But I was also looking at the governmental level of what kind of informal governance practices were around. And then on the other hand, I've been looking more into urban mobilities in Tbilisi and in Bishkek, so in Central Asia and Caucasus. But with this, we have also been doing a lot of comparative research. So I've been really looking at informal mobilities, also grounding this research or comparing this research with various places in what we know as Global South. A lot of this is published, so you will have to sometimes trust me on word when I will bring in information, but I would ask for your trust to say that there is actual data behind this, and I will always be able to provide this, because in this talk I will be doing a bit of summarizing and macro picture of all this research that otherwise could be told, of course, with more texture. And what do I want to tell you? And I was already sharing this with others, that I want to, in a way, already share the key takeaways of this talk. And then I will start delving into how I come to these key takeaways. And they are 5. One is, I want us to discuss informality today as a tool to demonize East for the prevalence of informality, or demonize informality for backwardness of the East, and while doing so, continuously push further the neoliberal project in the region. Secondly, the second statement, in a way, that I want to bring in is that informal practices cannot be assumed to be market-like, and very often they actually are not market-like, but are socially and culturally embedded and are organized around non-market logics of integration. Yet they are not remnants or just sticky cultural norms. They reproduce in response to various forms that marketization takes in the region. And the last is that beyond articulating this, that informal practices are not necessarily market-like, we need to continuously also see in what kind of political economies, in what kind of political entities do informal practices operate in, and this will define how much suffering people go through, right? It does matter how marketization unfolds. It does matter whether there is welfare of one sort or the other. It doesn't matter whether there is state regulation for, I don't know, urban public space, housing or not. A lot of macro things matter for informal economy. Now, as a base of how to define informality, I know that there is a lot of fancy, very philosophized definitions of informal economy. But I would really insist that there is no need, unless, like, once we engage with the deeper meanings of it, whether it is market-like, whether it's not, I will always be happy to go into details on this. But per se, as a phenomenon, I would very much, I'm myself someone that would draw on very basic definition of it, that it is something that is organized around the boundaries and regulations of the state. And the question is, which kind of state? But it is something that could have been regulated by the state in another place or another time. Gladly for us, because a lot of our lives is informality, right? Gladly for us, so far, for example, there is not so much regulation of our friendships. Of course, there are regulations that will affect our friendships, but it's not directly as brought in as a space of regulation. So, but this is, of course, also informality. But when we talk of studying informality or informal economy, we talk of those practices out of all informal practices that could have been regulatable, or that our civilization in different places and different times has imagined as regulatable or has regulated. And another key message in defining this is that it's a shifting one, because state is producing formality or regulations and therefore also informality. This is an always shifting one, the boundary of informality itself, and it is a site of, as Roy said, considerable state power and violence, because it is through establishing these boundaries of formality, informality, that also the boundaries of legitimacy, illegitimacy, humanness, inhumanness is defined in societies. Now, how this, if I had even more time, I would talk a lot about generally theories of informality. But I will now focus on theories of informality that have been dominant in post-socialist East, particularly. And if you look at this, you have one initial assumption that we have, many of us has argued against this, but it still actually is operating in the minds and hearts of many people, that informality is a transitional phenomenon. And this was the strongest, of course, in the 90s. And the assumption there is that with further marketization, with further modernization of formally socialist economies, these informal practices that became very visible, particularly in the 90s, will go away. Now, already by late 90s and early 2000s, it became very clear that this informality is not going away, even though in some places more. I mean, when we talk, just to specify, when we talk of post-socialist East, we are talking, especially at this point, maybe in the 90s, the difference was not so deep. But at this point, we are really talking of very different kinds of societies and economies. And yet, across the region, it became very clear that informality is not disappearing over time, at least not to the degree that modernization theory crowds would want to. Now, it sounds funny because this is also the period where informalization was deepening in the West, right? So if you looked at a broader picture, already since 70s, 80s, you have really deepening informalization of advanced economies in North Americas, in Europe, and elsewhere. So it's funny to think that, you know, we were like, East was assumed to emancipate itself from it, entering the capitalist system, which was informalizing at the point that East was entering it. And nevertheless, this narrative that in the East, informality not going away is because Eastern market economies are deficient, has been really dominant, and I would say it is still dominant till now, even though this is a narrative of 2000s. And the narrative, and this is this new institutionalist theory narrative and post-Washington consensus narrative, that yes, these countries established market economies, but their institutions are not good enough. So state cannot enforce market economy well enough, and this leaves the space for informal economy. And once the states are better at establishing even better market economies, that will take away informality, or that will reduce the role of informality in the region. And then you have, say, new space of theorizing informality that is not so new institutionalist, but more post-structuralist, diverse readings of informality that have articulated a lot of times this kind of social embeddedness of informality. But the issue that I take with quite a few of these readings is that these readings, of course, reveal very important things about informal economic practices in the region, but they don't take it to be their role to seriously engage with new institutionalist narrative. So without opposing it, sometimes the embeddedness story also feeds back in to the understanding of informality as something sticky that these societies carry because of their culture. And in a way then feeds back into the narrative that, you know, once you have better economies, this culture will become less relevant, or maybe we just leave it as it is because it's a cultural thing. To summarize this then, the initial thesis is that all places will develop and then everything will be fine. By now, I mean, already in the 90s, we should have known that capitalism is not the kind of system that allows all places to develop, right? But this still was a narrative that the region was very much fed with. In 2000s, the narrative turned into saying, well, there is this market-like practices, the new institutionalist narrative, and we just have to give it better market institutions to capture it. And then we have this way of saying everything is socially embedded, but this whole story has such a static attitude to it, right? It doesn't help us understand when do things change? What happens when further marketization takes place? What happens where further informalization takes place? If embeddedness is something that is a given, what defines the variation in well-being of various societies, right? If all economies, market economies, and informal spaces of economy are constantly market-like or socially embedded, how can you explain variation, right? And I think all of these approaches have very little capacity to handle this paradox that other scholars have noticed to be to be very dominant in interpreting informality in post-socialist region. And the paradox is that the reading of socialist second economy was that socialist second economy was very market-like thing. We had wrong socialist institutions, but people were still rational, so they were choosing to create black markets and enact their entrepreneurial spirit there. Now, in 2000s or in 90s already, you have right institutions in place, but then people started being blamed for having wrong culture. So there are good institutions. So the same actors that were portrayed as smart, rational in socialism became very irrational under capitalism. And again, as we said, then when this was hard to explain, we turned into saying, oh, the institutions are bad. Just as an example, because I have worked so much about this, this is not a phenomenon that is constrained to, or reading market likeness into informal practices is not something that is only done in post-socialist days. This is something that is really done in various fields across the globe, but also really in global south. And informal transport, because I've worked on it, provides a very good example, because this is also, I mean, this is like really diversity of informal mobility offers that are very often summarized as great examples of free markets operating. right? If you look into it again, I'm not sure that's the case, but when you have informality, it's not only in the East that people would read market likeness and rationality into it. So my solution to address this, and when I say mine, right, or when I present this work, it's of course not mine. It's just I don't want to now alone having presented these things make my statements or make my colleagues responsible of the statements. But most of this research that I'm presenting here is done collectively, especially with my colleague Leibniz, but also many other people. So together with him and others, our solution has been to take seriously Polanyian reading. And one could, of course, also take other readings. And with Polanyi as well, I have been very indebted to other readings of informal economy, particularly I've been indebted to this post-capitalist and diverse economist literature that in the first place somehow visibilized non-market likeness of many informal practices for me. But the reason why I always pick on Polanyi is precisely because Polanyi forces and urges us to not either take everything as market-like or everything as embedded, but to look at these two things as processes. Marketization involves this embedding of economies. So it comes into direct clash to what we know as non-market-like forms of social organization. So ultimately, there is this big tension between the two. And when you have the response to it, when you have groups trying to hold on to non-market-like practices, it's not something that is done automatically, but it's something that is done through a lot of mobilization, through a lot of effort individually and collectively. And it is directed at re-embedding or reclaiming economy from market forces. And in market forces, I mean, putting economic exchange in the hands to demand and supply principle, right? Draining the economy from social, political, environmental considerations. And because, again, from Polanyian reading and from our own experience, marketization is something very socially and environmentally costly. You will have re-embedding, but we can't assume that this re-embedding is always working well, right? People might suffer alongside it. Based on Polanyian reading, now I will be trying to kind of give you a glimpse of how it has helped me and maybe can help others to really work with informal and second economies in the East and maybe perhaps elsewhere. And first things first, the key thing to understanding the paradox of why informality was market-like under socialism and turned to be very culturally, well, let's say backward or stuck already under market economy. First thing to understand that is to actually look into so-called social second economy practices throughout socialism. And honestly, if you read second economy under socialism through Polanyian eyes, you would by default say that this could have never been free market economy, because market economy is not the same as existence of markets. Market economy, I mean, there is, in many times in history, markets existed, but not all of those times were capitalist economies. I mean, capitalism needs, and key to capitalism is essential commodification of fictitious commodities, land, labor, and money. And if you don't have that system, simply existence of some markets doesn't mean that these markets will be comprising a market economy. And the next thing is that if you actually look into these practices empirically, you will find that of course there is market of something, that there is some exchange, but it's not organized with demand and supply principle. It's actually organized, and there are gladly good anthropological studies for it. It's organized through a lot of reciprocal and redistributive channels. So yes, there are black markets, but they don't function as market-like entities truly. There will be certain market-like elements to it, but that's not the governing principle of this. So it's no surprise that under post-socialism, those second economy practices don't flourish as if they were market-like things. And also, and this is work that, of course, not just I have done, but a lot of people have done to visualize that, of course, also under post-socialism, informal economic practices are not always market-like. Especially informal economic practices of the subaltern groups that I have worked myself most with, like vendors, informal transport providers, informal parking guards. These are the communities that really work with non-commodified resources. They work with non-commodified money. And you might have heard, but I will mention some of these practices, right? People really pool money that is available to them and make it available for the community. People really rely on space through non-commercial means. People share labor, and this is non-commodified labor. And then they provide informal risk assurance spaces, right? I don't know, if we talk of marshrutka drivers, once a driver, because marshrutka drivers don't have formal insurance, and this is why it's important to always look back at structural things, right? There is no formal insurance system, or there used to be no formal insurance system in Tbilisi. There is still no formal insurance system in Bishkek, for example, and many other places. So what drivers would do when they had an accident was to pool money together and save each other. And of course, not everybody would end up using this, but it really works like a typical insurance scheme that you could think of, it just mobilized on the scale of smaller communities. But also in terms of and I'm talking now of urban practices that look very much market-like, right? I mean, petty trade is about trade. Marshrutka sector is a private sector. Ultimately, it looks like market-based practices, but even provision of services has not been truly based on the logic of demand and supply. Those providers of mobility, of whatever they trade with, they have made decisions based on their understandings of social justice to tailor it in different ways to socially vulnerable crowds, right? So the prices would be defined like that. Marshrutka drivers would decide to take someone for free, to take someone for a reduced price, to take this elderly lady closer to her home because she needs it and she can't walk it, right? There is this space of informality that allowed for this flexibility to address needs, like really social needs, and incorporate the understandings of social justice rather than selling the service and buying the service as free market entrepreneurs. So when you look at such a thing, it's hard to imagine the new institutionalist solution that you will now go and emancipate these practices or take them into capitalist world by providing good institutions, because these are not in themselves about profit and market-based rationality that we are told, right? But perhaps the most important, or one of the most important stories for me, and I should watch out for time, or not yet so much, is then to really articulate this tension between marketization and informal economic practices. Because it's one thing to say these are not market-like and we can't easily take them into market economy, but it's another thing to really observe what happens when states try to do so, and states do try to do so. And then we come to this, like, I will now really talk of Georgian experience more because this is where I'm most rooted. And there what happened was, and this is quite unprecedented, at least in post-Soviet region, because post-Soviet region is precisely the region that is demonized far more than EU member Central and Eastern Europe for having very bad, corrupt institutions. And one could say that Georgia is really a single country besides, again, I mean, Baltics, besides non-EU member Eastern Central European countries. Georgia is the single country in former Soviet Union which really did the recipe. They took the new institutionalist recipe and really they dropped the corruption. It still works. It works. Like, they dropped corruption, they reduced informality, or not informality, they reduced the role of informality for state institutions, and they really strengthened market supporting institutions. And then it became even more ridiculous. Why is not informality changing accordingly, in a way, right? And it was also weird how they gave this recipe, but ultimately it unfolded into a war between the state and informally operating agents. So it's really a puzzle on many levels. Why was it even bad for these small traders that you have more marketization, right? And this is something that might not come intuitively. But again, if you come back to the fact that this is not a market-like thing, and it really relies on those practices not being market-like, you then start understanding why actual marketization is so painful for informal traders or other types of informally operating economic agents. And to give a bit clearer and maybe a bit tangible example of street vendors and public spaces, right? The reason why the state really needed to, and what the state was doing was to say that vendors should not rely on public space, but they should go into bazaars, like more organized spaces, rent the stalls, and continue their trade there. And then there was this big clash because nobody wanted to go to bazaars, or nobody wanted to rent a place. In the first place, and this is another thing, this is the key side of the tension. Why does market economy need to do so? Why do you need to throw out the vendors if you are deepening marketization? And this is really key to marketization, to separate, to take out the public space, to take out, say, commercial activities out of public space and direct them into private space. So this is, in a way, the only way that you can enforce private property is to create clear boundaries with the public space. And this is really like, why would anyone buy water if it was for free type of question? Because as long as you can rely on public space for commercial activities with this kind of shadowy access, you will not be doing what market economy needs for accumulation, that is going and paying money to rent space on the private rental market. So this is why for a state like Georgia, it is important to attack, and this attack is a key thing. It is important to attack practices that rely on non-commodified, on their access to non-commodified resources, so that then the market economy or privately owned spaces and places can start growing the rent in very literal sense. So for Georgia state to establish such an institutional state, such an institutional context, it was really crucial to kick out the traders and push them into bazaars or in other kind of private spaces. But then what happens, unlike what new institutionalists would imagine, what happens when you push people to really operate in relation to, in this case, private rental markets, is that these rental markets, capitalist rental markets, prices will fluctuate there, they will be unreliable, and not all entrepreneurs will be successful. You will have some guys that will manage it, but you will have many of them that will just not afford it. So what do you do with those crowds in a state, and this is again very important, in a state which actually really provides almost no social welfare? And this is the key thing, right? You want to apply market solution to a problem which is ultimately not a business problem, it's a social problem. You deal with crowds that have notes, like they don't have skills they can sell on existing labor market, they don't have property, they don't have capital. And it's not surprising, first of all, that they will fail in free market entrepreneurial context. And they also have nowhere to go once they fail. So once they fail, and that's the next thing, right? Once they fail, that's the interesting part, because that's when, on the one hand, people start relying on pre-existing social networks. And on the other hand, once they really start to elaborate new informal practices in response to specific episodes of marketization. And this is what I'm telling, right? This is a specific episode of deepening marketization in Polese urban context, where the state decides to, free the public space from commercial activities. And in this specific point, what happens is that first, vendors, many of them really not affording to operate within this new framework, they start protesting. The state represses. I mean, this is a repeated story of repression of the protest, and this is again very important, right? The framework of illegality and informality there is very, very important, because these types of crowds are often demonized by pointing out that they're doing illegal things. And urban middle classes are very much at ease at, accepting such demonization, that these are backward crowds, they're making our streets look unmodern, dirty. So all the violence that state does on such subaltern groups, through framing them as illegitimate citizens, is very often tolerated, actually. So once the protest won't work, then these crowds do, and they did in this case, really started elaborating, and I don't want to romanticize this, but they started really elaborating very creative strategies on how to address this dilemma. So they could no longer put stalls on the street. And there was one guy who was selling books. He took a wall of a publicly owned building that was possible to arrange as shelves. And he basically put up all his books there and continued vending, right? And because it was such a gray space, the city hall administration could really not argue with him. And he somehow managed through this. Others really started having mobile stalls. They would have stalls on wheels, so that if the police or city hall administrations were after them, they would run. Then they had also this kind of collective approaches, right? They would sit down, groups of vendors would sit down, but there would be always someone on the watch. If someone's approaching, they would be able to pack up and run. I mean, there were so many things that people did to nevertheless continue having access to public space for trading. But again, this did mean that a lot of them really suffered compared to the situation that they had before. They did survive, they came up with good solutions, they managed, but they really suffered. I mean, imagine, and this was very systematic those days, old ladies running away from the police was a daily thing, and then they would fall. Their blood pressure would go up. They would need to call the ambulance. This type of really, I mean, I'm now telling a very dramatic story, but this was the story of Tbilisi in those years. I'm talking primarily of 2009 and 2012. This repeats after that many times. And yet another thing to articulate this tension and to show how, these responses are also, some new responses are always emerging in response to marketization, is that it's not only those actors like vendors, marshutka drivers and others that elaborate new mechanisms, but also street level bureaucrats too. And this is what I myself call informalization of countermovement. So if you come back to this Polanyian story, what Polanyi would say is that once marketization's tough social costs are revealed, there will be movement against it. What Polanyi usually imagines is that this will be more institutionalized response where the state will be involved. Now, in a country like Georgia, where the state really refused and continues to refuse to intervene in easing up these costs. What happens that states still ends up, because they simply just can't, like when you do such a thing on your citizens, when these citizens really fall on the streets, you simply sometimes can't not engage with it. So instead of coming up with some kind of more institutionalized solutions, they started coming up with this really ad hoc solutions. So this city hall, this is one example of the city hall supervisor discussing this, but there are more, and they were so confused. They were like, no, we're not intervening. Georgian state loves free market economy, and we cannot intervene in the economy. What we just do is that we take street vendors by hands and we come to negotiate with bazaar owners so that these prices that are fluctuating and street vendors cannot go inside because these prices are crazy, so that, you know, they have some stability. So in effect, this is state agents still trying to ease the mess that is produced by marketization in this, you know, very small scale context, but they do it again informally. And I think this informalization of counter-movement is a very important story, in a sense that I think this is happening in many places. There is a lot of pain that is being induced by different, like by market economies taking up different spaces of our lives, right? What Harvey would call dispossession, accumulation by dispossession, right? There is dispossession happening in various forms and in various spaces. And systemically, in many parts of the world, states are not, or no political entities are really often there to have institutionalized responses. So the type of responses are also informalized in this way. But again, my story with this, with a Georgian example of it, is that informalization of the counter movement, that is states' refusal to really have more social welfare in the country, resulted really statistically in devastated outcomes in terms of poverty and inequality. And this was surprising. Again, I don't have the data here, but it is unbelievable just how, you know, in 2000s, in the times that this was happening, most of other post-Soviet countries had this period where poverty was decreasing. And in the role model Georgia, poverty was increasing in this decade, right? Even in places that did not have improvement of institutions, which I don't think was improvement, it was a brutal deepening of market reform. It was really clear that without having something that would ease up this process, and with allowing counter movement to really informalize, and with rejecting or not engaging with the protest seriously, Georgian state produced really major exclusions in the country. And the last part of more empirical story that I wanted to tell you is that what we see recently is also something very interesting with this. So in this sense, like what has been happening in the last decade is very interesting, because you see that states have not managed to deal with informality in many ways, right? And they have produced social costs, but they have not managed to, how do I say, entirely forbid people from relying on informal mechanisms of survival in case of this type of subaltern groups. But particularly in urban mobility, we have seen that corporate players have become really good at capturing informal economy and starting to capture profit from informal economy, particularly by entering urban mobility space. So this whole story of Uber, Bolt, etc., is a very, very interesting one, because they are succeeding where states have been failing in bringing, like in managing to aggregate or take out the profit from small players. And really states have failed in this. I mean, post-Soviet states, at least, have often failed with this. But the platforms are really succeeding. And this is a scary thing because if previously, if you look at the marsrutka sector, right? If, say, a sector was formalized to a degree, but social embeddedness was still, of those practices was still possible informally, like marsrutka drivers had to work under the private company. They were self-employed still, so they were not getting secure salaries. So there was no formal embeddedness or no formal change in their labor situation, but they still had their communities that could support them. What happens after is that you have Uber that really alienates these crowds or other app-based mobility. So all these community-based informal mechanisms of supporting also kind of are no longer there. And I really don't know. I mean, of course, again, people will figure out something, you know, drivers might not cooperate with each other, but they will have families that will support them in case of hazards or so on. But I really don't know what happens in this situation. How do you ensure that people's risks and people's pains are addressed once you have this type of capture of the sectors by corporate digitalized players? Now, I do think I could talk about this much more, but I do think I should wrap up at one point. One more thing I wanted to reflect on together with you, but we can really discuss more on this in the discussion session, is what kind of political project do we imagine out of socially embedded informal practices? And I do feel strongly with something that lately Sima and Sova voiced, to visibilize the endurance of sharing and solidarity despite all the marketization that has been taking place in the region. But I'm also very cautious and scared, particularly because of the type of examples that is happening in urban mobility. You visibilize this space of sharing, and then they become captured by the market players. Besides that, there is this issue of fatigue from informality, right? Informality is something that people are just tired of. But that, I think, is still a very important political project, because I think this is exactly where we should be engaging with and valorizing it. And I think like many of these informal practices are demonized because they're undervalued. But once we start, also as academics, as political agents, as political subjects, once we start really pointing out what kind of value is there in existence and reproduction of those solidarity and sharing networks, maybe we can address the fatigue issue differently. I will stop at this. I will contemplate on this together with you maybe a bit more.
Many thanks, Lola, for this fascinating talk.